Hello, this is Jason from Liberate Raleigh, and this is another Liberate Raleigh video. So this video is going to be the last video in the Voluntary City series. There's only one more chapter to cover, and that is the final epilogue chapter, wherein they kind of put a little bow or a cherry on top of the whole book and kind of tie it all together. So one of the main themes throughout this book is the concept of market failure and how public goods, the supposed reasoning being that public goods should be provided because of market failure. Therefore, these things cannot be provided privately. They have to be provided by the government. However, it's more accurate to look at these things as market challenges as opposed to market failures. It's not that these things cannot be provided, it's that maybe there are certain challenges involved with them, but these challenges are obviously not insurmountable given the material covered in the previous chapters of the book. These things are provided and they are done privately and done in an efficient manner. Another thing covered in this epilogue chapter is it's pointed out that economists, they're the people that make these sorts of theoretical arguments for market failure and government provision of these so-called public goods. But one of the things that they can do that they sort of get into trouble with is they'll argue from theory to empiricism. Well, not to empiricism, from theory to empirical. They'll go from theoretical to empirical arguments. So what I mean by that is they'll have this nice elaborate market failure theory for public goods, and they'll apply that to specific things and draw conclusions from it. So I'm going to mention a couple examples of this and show how this gets them into trouble. And this was covered in the epilogue chapter. So the two examples are, first, the example of beekeepers and apple farmers. And if you look at the supposed theory behind market failure and public goods, and there was an economist that actually made this argument, he said that subsidies are justified in this scenario because pollination, which is done freely by the bee to the apple flowers, is not compensated. And conversely, the nectar that is provided by the apple blossoms is gathered by the bees, which is used, but it is also not compensated. So it would appear, based on the market failure / public goods economic theories, that this is a justification for government intervention and subsidies. The other example that was brought up, and this was brought up in Paul Samuelson's classic economic texts, is the one of lighthouses. And this was many years ago. He brought this up. Lighthouses emit light off the coast, and any ship that comes towards the coast will see this light, and none of the ship, because it's simply projected out there, it can't be excluded. Any ship out there, whether they pay for the service or not, will see the light. So supposedly these are examples of arguments for public provision of these goods and services in the real world. Supposedly, the government would have to engage in action in order to provide these services. But there's just one problem. And that problem is, in both scenarios, these goods and services were provided by the private sector. In the case of beekeepers and apple farmers, and this I knew even before I read the part in the book where they cover the real world example. I have an interest in beekeeping, so I knew that this was the case. pollination and nectar services are bought and sold on the market. So the idea that they are public goods and should be provided through subsidies is a non-starter, because they actually are handled via private market mechanisms. And the other one, the lighthouses, was refuted by Ronald Coase in a very classic article where he points out that lighthouses were in fact provided privately through voluntary measures. And if you're interested, you can look that up and read all about it. So we have these scenarios where economists try to use their theory to make empirical statements, and the empirical statements regarding these public goods and the private sector and market failure end up being incorrect. And that's what these chapters in this book end up doing. They turn the public goods argument on its head through pointing out improving existence of these things in the private sector. Another important thing that is pointed out in this chapter is the importance of the pricing mechanism for the provision of these goods and services, and not just that they should be provided through the market mechanism and voluntary means, but also how. And this is another case where an example will help explain this, and we have to go back to Paul Samuelson again. Paul Samuelson said that, made the argument that TV broadcasts are a public good because the marginal cost of an additional viewer is zero. Therefore, the price should be zero. Therefore, they cannot be provided on the market. So to explain this a little bit more, if you can think about a network broadcasting their signal into the airwaves, then it doesn't matter how many people receive the signal. It doesn't affect, if one person or 1 million people receive the signal, it doesn't affect anybody's ability to view it. So the cost of an additional viewer is zero. There's no cost to having one more viewer. So the idea that you can charge for this sort of service would seem to be negated by this analysis. However, the problem is, and this is how it ended up occurring, the problem is prices don't simply indicate what should be provided. They indicate how these things should be provided and the nature of their provision, the nature of the good itself. So it's not simply a matter of, okay, we're just broadcasting anything and for free. Everything should be broadcasted for free because it doesn't matter, because the marginal cost of the additional viewer is zero, so you can't charge for it. It matters what sort of things are broadcast, what sort of viewing, what sort of shows are going to be broadcast. And prices, and this was borne out through pay for television, like through cable and now satellite services and streaming services on the internet. Pricing data allowed for entrepreneurs to determine what sort of television and video services people desired. So it doesn't follow that these things shouldn't be provided because, it doesn't make sense to charge for them because the marginal cost is zero. There's no gain, there's no economic gain to charging for them. Well, that's simply not true. The economic gain comes from the ability to determine what should and should not be produced and the manner in which these things are produced. And as history has shown in the intervening years, many different types of video streaming services and just television in general, pay for TV, pay for video services, have popped up and provided a plethora of different sorts of broadcasts and viewing pleasure for people to enjoy. So the pricing mechanism here serves a very important purpose that is borne out historically. And to tie this pricing analysis to the goods and services mostly discussed within the book, these goods and services typically tend to be tied together, tied either to location or to each other, and the pricing mechanism through the voluntary market dynamic allows entrepreneurs to determine which public goods and services should be provided and how on the open market. And these goods and services include, everything from legal services to roads and so on and so forth, and also the provision of constitutional governing rules, which are guided by the pricing mechanism, so entrepreneurs can determine which of these to tie together in what configuration, and how to provide them and what to provide. So it's very important for this pricing mechanism to be in place, and it serves a very critical economic purpose that creates economic benefits for everybody. Also, as a complement to this pricing information, there are, of course, non-pricing factors, because economics deals with subjective valuations and subjective utility. These non-price factors are equally, I would say at least equally as important as pricing factors, and this can be seen again through examples provided within the book The Voluntary City. First off, there were the turnpike associations, which I covered in a prior video, which were not profitable. They generally were unprofitable, and they were known to be unprofitable, so it would seem to make no sense for these things to be provided privately, and yet they were. And the reason for this, or one of the critical reasons, was the social status and pressure that was utilized. So people would engage in these things not merely because they were of some sort of financial benefit, because again, they were not profitable, although there were indirect financial benefits, but that wasn't the only consideration. Another very critical consideration was the social status that one could gain, and social standing, and the social pressure that was applied on people to provide these services. And there's some other examples where non-price factors were very critical, and those were, say for example, friendly societies and mutual aid societies, which help to provide they would part of their existence was not simply to provide financial benefits to their clientele, to their members, but also to provide non-monetary benefits in the form of various sorts of training, moral virtue support, and experience in various avenues that maybe the members would not have exposure to. So a bunch of non-monetary benefits, in this case as well, were provided through these associations. So as a complement, you have the pricing mechanism on one side, but you also have non-monetary, non-price factors on the other that went into the provision of these goods and services, and were very critical in guiding how they were provided and what specific goods and services were provided by them. So some other things that were covered in this final chapter was some analysis of the legal systems and law in general. And it was pointed out, and this I think is accurate, and they make mention of Friedrich Hayek, who pointed out that laws and legislation in particular, legislation doesn't create laws. Writing the laws down isn't the creation of laws, and this was understood by the earliest codifiers of laws. They weren't writing something new, they were simply writing down laws and customs for regulating the interaction of people that already existed. And these things, these customs and these laws, they arose through what Hayek would refer to as the spontaneous order. And this is a spontaneous order of voluntary interaction between human beings. So it's important to note again that these laws were not written out of thin air. These laws were customs that already existed and were simply written down to preserve them for posterity. Now, this ties into the book because the book has a chapter on legal systems, and this chapter covers the law merchant. Now, this law merchant, and again, I covered this in a prior video, so if you want to hear more about this, but in general, it arose spontaneously because there were incentives for these sorts of rules to govern trade across large geographical regions, because trade started to expand. So these rules became sort of a necessity and in order to facilitate this trade. And the governments were almost explicitly avoiding the responsibility or the authority to actually engage in creating these rules. So these laws would, in the law merchant, they would arise spontaneously because, again, there were incentives for these rules to appear, and there were incentives for these rules to be efficient. For example, one of the things that came out of this was that any sort of local bias would tend to be eliminated, because that would not facilitate trade amongst different locales. And so any sort of bias like that would tend to be eliminated, because if you're a visiting merchant, you want to be treated fairly, and if there's some sort of bias when you're dealing with the local merchants, then obviously that's going to hinder trade. You're not going to want to do this. You're not going to want to deal with these people because you're not going to be treated fairly. So the law merchant would tend to eliminate this sort of thing. And the other reason that these sorts of rules would tend to be created in an efficient manner with the law merchant was the adjudicators in the law merchant were merchants themselves. So they would want to be treated fairly. And also these merchants would tend to be experts in the particular sort of trade that they were regulating. So they had very specialized knowledge of certain areas of trade, and this allowed them to be more effective adjudicators. And this would, through the spontaneous order of Hayek, the spontaneous interaction of people voluntarily, would lead to more efficient rules developed over time, and lead to the vast economic benefits that the law merchant system of law created by facilitating more widespread trade amongst different geographical regions, which is, of course, of great economic benefit to humanity as a whole. So on the other side of the coin, from the law merchant were the prosecution associations. And these prosecution associations acted similar to insurance companies in that they would oftentimes compensate their members for property loss. But the other thing was, this allowed them to provide for crime deterrence in the form of prosecuting, tracking down criminals, pursuing evidential leads, assembling evidence, again, to prosecute these people, and also to provide for neighborhood watches or other sort of policing efforts, which again would engage in deterrence. And by tying the insurance aspect to the deterrent aspect, allowed this service to be funded and provided. And this, again, you hear this happens, and this has been brought up in numerous other chapters, the ability to tie different services together or to locations allows for, or is one way to mitigate, if not completely eliminate, the supposed public goods market failure issues with these things. And so one of the things, and this is something new that was brought up in this chapter, is to talk about the target hardening aspect of these things, of the prosecution associations. So one of the ways that the benefits of a prosecution association could be internalized was they would advertise their members. They would advertise that certain people were members. So everyone would know, okay, Bob over there, he's a member of the prosecution association XYZ, so if you steal from him, there's a significantly greater chance that you are going to be prosecuted and perhaps punished. So what this ends up doing is it creates harder targets. So that creates a dichotomy of harder targets versus softer targets. And one sort of argument against private provision of these sorts of things is that by hardening certain targets, you make softer targets more susceptible to crime because criminals will avoid the hard targets and go for the soft targets. Now, this doesn't really follow because not only is there a substitution effect involved, there's also an income effect. So the substitution effect is what I just described. It's the idea that, okay, in this specific example, you're looking at two different people. One is a harder target, one is a softer target. You decide to go after the softer target instead of the hard one. So you're substituting the soft target, the soft target for the hard target. So in mass, in the aggregate, the general tendency will be for the hard targets to be avoided and the soft targets will be substituted for them as potential victims. Now, this can seem like a bad thing for the soft targets initially. However, it doesn't take into account the income effect. Now, what that means is because there are more hard targets, then overall, the average income one can expect through engaging in crime will go down because the harder targets are no longer on the table, or they're on the table to a much lesser degree. So once you remove them or significantly reduce them, then what happens is the average income of engaging in crime goes down. So that will tend to mean that even for the soft targets, the amount of crime being executed against them decreases. So overall, things are better, even when you look at the soft targets. Now, as pointed out earlier in the book, public provision of police didn't step in and start providing a service that didn't exist. It replaced existing private provision of police. And another example of this, which was brought up in the book, is education. Education was also being provided privately, and then the public sector stepped in and started crowding it out. And so here are two examples where there was already existing private provision, but the public sector took it over and crowded it out. So there's a little bit more, and I'm going to get into that just now. There's these these two things are there's a connection, sort of similarity between education and police here. So to understand the issues regarding the public police and education, it's important to understand that public provision of a good or service relative to private provision of that good or service doesn't merely change the funding. It's not simply a matter of a check being written, metaphorically speaking. It also alters the nature of the good and how it is provided. And this is one reason why public goods and services, like for example in this instance, police and education, were provided, was shifted over via the political process from private provision to public provision, because the nature of the goods and services provided was not provided privately. Now, the contrast here with, say, the police was the political elites, the people who, the wealthier people who generally would have much more control over the political process and the levers of power in that manner, would favor certain things being done by the police that were not provided privately. They tended to want the police to be used to maintain orderliness or to enforce various moral values or moral customs that upon the population that the private police would not do. So the reason why they would switch to, again, to the public provision of the service was the private sector would not provide them. So the elites wanted to use the police as a bludgeon on what they considered an unruly and immoral public. Now, conversely, and the reason why they couldn't use the private sector for this was because the private police and prosecution associations were focused on preventing and prosecuting, for the purposes of compensation to the victims, crimes against person and property. This is because that's what people would voluntarily pay for. That good or service was what the population wanted. That's what the customers of the private prosecution associations wanted. They wanted protection for their person and protection for their property from theft. You would not be able to convince people to voluntarily provide for, say, moralistic enforcement upon other people. They may be able to say, well, they may want to, saying and acting are two different things. So they may say, oh yeah, I would like to enforce, say, temperance upon people, but when you actually have to pay up and act on that, that's a totally different matter. So when people were willing to pay voluntarily for policing services, the policing services they wanted were protection of person and property. However, politically, the costs of these things can be externalized onto other people. So the people that controlled the levers of power within the government could use them for their own moralistic grandstanding and to use them as an enforcement mechanism on the general public, which they considered unruly and immoral. Now, for the other example of this happening, the public schools that were used to replace private schools, again, they were used, and this was apparent early on, by the people that were promoting them as a means to force various cultural norms upon the population. To the point where, the rhetoric involved became very heated, in that people were literally saying that the public schools, that that this was a quote-unquote war with the devil. So people would view this literally as sort of a fight to fight against Satan, so to speak. So these cultural norms, which the people that controlled the government wanted to have enforced, were implemented through the public schooling system. It was literally a form of indoctrination. And some specific examples, a specific example of this was when there was significant immigration from non-Protestant countries. A lot of, again, non-Protestants entered the country, and many of them were Catholic. So a lot of people wanted to use the public schools as a mechanism to force various cultural norms that were already existing in the country onto the new immigrants who did not hold these particular cultural norms. So again, this was a form of indoctrination. So there were all these Protestants already living in the country, and they see, wow, look at all these Catholics coming into the United States. Well, we can't let them just continue being, living the way they normally live. Let's indoctrinate their children through the public schooling system and force our particular cultural norms on them. So here you have the use of government force to make people change their cultural norms through the indoctrination tool of public schools. And it was understood at the time that you could not use private schools to do this. It had to be tax-funded public schools because those could be centrally controlled through the government. The private schools were spread out and decentralized and diffuse. And so you couldn't simply control one government apparatus and therefore through it control a huge network of schools. The amount of effort to coordinate all of that, to coordinate all the effort that would be involved in taking over all of those schools would be enormous and far beyond anything that would be voluntarily undertaken, which is why they had to resort to the involuntary violence of the government to force these norms on people. So the other reason why private schools simply would not do this, in addition to the fact that they were decentralized and diffuse, the other reason, perhaps a more critical reason, was private schools were beholden to their customers. Their customers in this instance were the parents of the children that went to the school. So if a school decided we're going to start forcing a whole bunch of Protestant religious norms on people that didn't want them, then the parents would simply pull their kids out of the school and send them somewhere else where those norms were not forced on them. And if no such thing existed, then obviously a market incentive would be created for the building up of schools that did not force these norms on the children. And here again, and this is similar to the instance of the private policing services, where the customers would not voluntarily demand these sorts of services. So here we have sort of a parallel there. And in that instance, both instances, in fact, the government authority was required in order to force this upon the population. Otherwise, you simply have people acting in their self-interest and engage in wanting education services that are the parents feel is best for their children, as opposed to what someone else thinks is best for their children. And the policing and legal services will tend to devolve towards protection of person and property, as opposed to whatever moralistic endeavors that people may feel like they want to force on people. So, a couple final notes, one of which the book and this epilogue does not cover this topic, and that is the topic of national defense and military services. However, just my own personal opinion here, based on my reading of the book, and this is something I think it requires more research and calls out for more research. I think that the information provided in this book, the examples that were provided, can give some insight into how defense services, geographic defense services, military defense services could and perhaps would be provided in a purely voluntary manner. You have, if you look at what is covered in the book, voluntary associations, you look at the social aspect of the provision of these things, the tying of these things to various, the tying of public goods to various locations. All of these things, I believe, would be very important factors for the provision of defense services. I think that a good case could be made for these services to be provided via association, like perhaps a militia association that is created through voluntary membership, and perhaps looking at other things, other templates, so to speak, template mechanisms, the tying of these militias to various locations, and also, like with the turnpike associations, the idea of social status being tied to them. So, I mean, you may look at, it may turn out that, for example, if you live in a certain area, then there are certain communities that come up that are built in this area will tend to tie either membership in the militia or support, financial support for the militia to the location. So you may develop a neighborhood, and when these plots in the neighborhood are sold, support or membership in the militia could be tied to that sale and to that location. And the other aspect is that I mentioned, the social status. It could be like, for example, again with the turnpike associations, social status could be tied to membership in a militia. So let's say if you support the militia and you provide a lot of resources for the militia, maybe you buy 1,000 firearms and donate them to the militia, or you help to recruit people to be members of the militia, or you do a lot of work and activity to for training for training exercises and so on and so forth, then your social standing rises. So they didn't cover this in the book, and again, there's a lot of other things that if there was a purely voluntary city that existed, a lot of laws relating to firearms, probably all of them, I would think, wouldn't exist. So there wouldn't be any sort of limitation on what private individuals could own. So military level weapons would not be forbidden to the general public. So the general public would have access to at least all the machinery and weaponry that they would most likely need in order to engage in a reasonable defense of their whatever area, geographical area they're living in. And combined with all the other things, militia associations, the social standing, I think that this is a good, at least at a minimum, it's a good a good analytical starting point for a different way of examining and looking at the issue of national defense, because it seems like a lot of analysis tends to try to replicate what the government is doing, or to look at things from them being provided through private defense associations or private defense agencies, which are profit-seeking, and shortened for PDAs. But after reading this book, I think that the voluntary association sort of militia, I think that template combined with social status is a much more interesting, and I think a much more realistic outcome for this. But again, this is just my general thoughts and the things that this is just what I was thinking about while reading the book, but it certainly requires more study, more analysis. I'll probably be looking at it in the future, maybe make some videos on it after some further research. So the final thought here is the voluntary city, the phrase voluntary city could be changed to voluntary civilization, because one of the things they point out, or one of the things that is claimed in this epilogue chapter, is that the city forms the root unit for civilization. It's the compact unit by which all of the goods and services of civilization are provided. And so it's sort of accurate to refer to it as the voluntary civilization. So the question is, how do you want the civilization that you live in, what nature do you want it to have? Do you want the services, the goods and services of civilization to be provided voluntarily through free association and interaction amongst people, as are done in the examples of this book? Or do you want them to be done through coercion, the government method? Do you want them to be done through public authority, through having the proverbial gun to people's heads to force them to support and execute the various quote-unquote solutions to these public goods issues? So that's the final question. Do you want voluntarism or do you want coercion? And I mean, the choice is up to you. I know which one I want. I want voluntary interaction and peace amongst people. I don't want involuntary forced associations, which essentially is a war amongst people. Even if it's not an actual explicit war being engaged, there's always that threat of warfare being engaged against the population. So that's where I stand on this issue. This is the last video for the Voluntary City. I found this is one of the best books I think I've read on this topic. It was extremely interesting. I found a lot of avenues for further research that I plan to get into and will probably cover in future videos. I hope you guys liked it. I hope you got a lot of information from it. And again, all I did was I covered this from a very high level. Highly encourage you to go out and buy the book and read it. You will not regret it. You will thank me for it. And with that, that's the end of this video. I hope you guys have a great day, and I'll see you all in the next video. Take care.